You know, the greatest strategic failure in sales is this belief that a large purchase requires a large pitch, this massive, high-pressure effort aimed at a skeptical buyer. We've all been on the receiving end of that, right? The slick presentation, the endless follow-ups, it's just exhausting. But what if that entire approach is built on a complete misunderstanding of how our minds work? What if the real sales battle isn't won with that big, stressful decision, but way earlier, at the lowest friction point you can imagine? We're talking about a single, tiny yes that can quietly, but powerfully, compel a buyer toward the final, big purchase. Over the next few minutes, we're going to deconstruct this, the commitment bias. It's a psychological principle that doesn't just tweak sales strategy, it turns it completely on its head.
So here's our roadmap. First, we're going to tear down the high-pressure sales myth to see why our instincts are so often wrong. Then, we'll get to the good stuff, the power of a micro yes. After that, we dive into the science, the self-persuasion engine. This is where the really cool stuff, like cognitive dissonance, comes in. Once we get the why, we'll get practical with how to engineer commitment. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with the biggest idea of all. You're not just selling a product, you're selling a committed identity.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the high-pressure sales myth. Before we can get to the right way to do things, we have to understand why the common approach, that big, flashy pitch, usually just creates more resistance. We've got to figure out why we get this so wrong. This quote just nails the core problem. We see a big price tag, and we automatically think we need a proportionally big effort. We assume that to get someone to say yes, we need to overwhelm them with facts, features, and pressure. But think about how that feels on the other side. It immediately puts you on the defensive, right? It frames the whole thing as a fight. And it's all based on a total illusion. And that illusion is this idea of external persuasion. We think selling is about applying some outside force, kind of like trying to push a giant boulder up a steep hill. But the truth is, the most powerful persuasion isn't external at all. It's internal. The secret isn't forcing someone to agree with you. It's about creating the perfect conditions for them to convince themselves.
So this leads to the big question, the paradox at the heart of this whole thing. What if we've been focusing on completely the wrong moment? What if the critical point isn't that final yes to the big purchase, but a tiny, almost trivial yes at the very beginning? What if that's what kicks off an unstoppable psychological chain reaction? That's exactly what we're about to unpack.
That chain reaction starts with a single drop. And that brings us to our second section, understanding the incredible power of what we call a micro yes. This isn't some new sales gimmick. It's a classic psychological strategy known as the foot-in-the-door technique.
So here it is, the textbook definition. You get someone to agree to a large request by having them agree to a modest one first. Think about it like this. If you ask your neighbor to water your entire garden for 2 weeks while you're away, that's a big ask. But what if you first ask, hey, could you just grab my mail for me? They say yes. Well, now they've already agreed to help. They see themselves as a helpful person. So when you later ask about the plants, they are way more likely to say yes. That first small agreement is a powerful lever.
And this is so important to understand. The whole system, everything that follows, hinges on that first tiny commitment. The game isn't won at the end. It's won the moment you secure that first seemingly insignificant yes. Everything else is just a domino effect.
So, this journey from that small yes to the big sale happens in 3 clear psychological phases. It starts with the micro-commitment, that first active step. As soon as that happens, the person's brain kicks into gear with phase 2, internal justification, where it tries to make sense of what it just did. And that justification creates the pressure for phase 3, consistent action, where the big purchase suddenly feels like the only logical thing to do. Let's break each of these down.
All right, let's dig into phase 1 because it's the most important. This initial micro-commitment can't just be any small action. For this to work, it has to be what we call an active seed. If you get this part wrong, the whole process just fizzles out before it even starts.
For this seed to actually grow in someone's mind, it needs 3 things. First, it has to be active. It requires real effort, not just passively watching something. Second, it needs to be public. Now, that doesn't mean you shout it from the rooftops, it just means it's an action they are consciously aware they are taking. And third, this is crucial, it has to be completely voluntary. They have to feel like it was their choice.
Now, this slide makes it super clear. On the left, you've got these passive things we see all the time, right? Signing up for an email list, downloading a PDF, barely any effort. But on the right, you have active commitments. Customizing a template actually takes work. Filling out a detailed diagnostic takes real thought. And paying for something, even a tiny amount, well, that's a huge active commitment.
And that brings us to the ultimate active seed, the tripwire.
It's a small, low-cost offer, often just a few dollars. It seems tiny, but that small financial stake fundamentally changes the psychology. That person is no longer just a browser. They've become a customer. They have skin in the game. And as you're about to see, that simple act of spending even a little bit of money triggers a powerful need to justify that decision.
So once that active seed is planted, whether it was through effort or a tiny purchase, a powerful psychological engine just roars to life inside our heads. And that brings us to section 3, the self-persuasion engine. This is where our brain takes over and does all the heavy lifting for us, all thanks to our deep-seated need to be consistent.
At the heart of this engine is the commitment and consistency principle, made famous by Dr. Robert Cialdini. It basically says that we have this almost obsessive desire to stick to our guns. Once we make a choice or take a stand, we feel this immense internal pressure to behave in a way that's consistent with that decision. Nobody wants to be seen as a flip-flopper.
So think about what's happening in someone's head after they fill out your diagnostic or buy that $7 tool. Subconsciously, the pressure is on, but it's not coming from a salesperson. It's coming from inside their own mind. They now have a personal stake in proving to themselves that they made a smart choice.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. We all like to think of ourselves as smart, rational people. So what happens when we do something like spend 15 minutes on a free tool or spend a few bucks that seems a little out of character? How does our brain square that circle to maintain our self-image as a savvy decision maker?
The answer is something called cognitive dissonance. It's that cringy, uncomfortable feeling of mental static you get when your actions don't quite line up with your beliefs, and our brains hate that feeling. After making that small, active commitment, our brain sees this dissonance as a problem that must be solved, and the way it solves it is by creating a new story that makes everything seem perfectly logical.
And that brings us neatly to phase 2, the brain's internal justification. You can think of this like a silent, internal monologue that starts the second that commitment is made. Its only job is to get rid of that uncomfortable dissonance and create a nice, coherent story. Let's listen in on what that might sound like.
First, the monologue just states the facts. The brain registers what happened. It can't deny it. Okay, I definitely just spent 15 minutes on that website. Or, yep, I did just spend $7 on that guide. The action is on the books. It's an undeniable fact.
And here comes the spin. To make sense of that action, the brain creates a justification. Well, I wouldn't have spent all that time and energy if this wasn't really important to me. So I guess I must be pretty serious about solving this problem. See what it did there?
And this is the magic trick. This is the whole point. That justification leads to a profound shift in how they see themselves. The person's internal story literally changes. They're no longer just a casual browser. To be consistent, their brain assigns them a brand new identity. They are now a committed problem solver.
And that new identity is what kicks off the final phase, consistent ascension. Once that identity is locked in, the person is now driven to take actions that are in line with it. With this new self-image as a committed problem solver, the bigger purchase isn't seen as a scary sales decision anymore. It's now reframed as the only logical, consistent next step for someone like them.
And that's the psychological lock-in. Think about that for a second. At this point, the psychological pain of being inconsistent, of admitting they weren't really serious after all, becomes greater than the financial pain of buying the product. To back out now would be to shatter that new positive identity they just built, and our brains will gladly pay money to avoid that.
Okay, so we've gone deep into the psychology. That's the why. Now let's get practical. How do you actually build this? Let's turn all these insights into an actionable framework you can use.
It's really a 3-step playbook, and it lines up perfectly with the psychology we just talked about. Step 1, you have to intentionally engineer an active first step. Step 2, you define the consistent identity with your messaging. And step 3, you utilize Tripwire logic to seal the deal.
So for step 1, you have to think beyond the simple email sign-up. Your first ask has to demand a little something. Ask for effort. Ask them to customize something. Ask them to fill out a detailed quiz. Get them to invest real thought, because that thought is the seed of their commitment.
For step 2, it's all about how you talk to them. You have to connect the dots between that small action and the bigger purchase. Frame the next step as the obvious conclusion. Use language like, since you already committed to optimizing your workflow by completing our diagnostic, you're not selling them, you're just reminding them of who they've already decided to be.
And finally, step 3, the tripwire. This is sometimes called a self-liquidating offer, or SLO, because the goal isn't profit, it's just to get a committed customer. That small financial commitment is the most powerful micro yes there is. It instantly changes the entire relationship. They aren't a lead anymore, they're a paying customer, and their brain will do backflips to feel good about that.
Okay, and this brings us to our final, and I think most important section. This is the core insight that ties this entire system together. It's not about selling a product, it's about selling an identity.
So if you take away just one thing, let it be this: you cannot force commitment. A high-pressure pitch is like trying to hammer a nail into concrete. You're just going to meet resistance. It doesn't work. Instead, you have to engineer it, piece by piece, starting with that one small active step. It's a process, not a single event.
The real genius of this whole thing is that it works with human nature, not against it. When you build this ladder of ascending micro yeses, the customer never feels like they're being sold to. The final purchase feels like 100% their idea, the natural, obvious conclusion to a journey they chose to start.
So when you boil it all down, what's the fundamental secret that makes this work so well? What's the one big thought I want to leave you with?
It's this: the best marketing doesn't push people through a funnel with force. It works because it doesn't sell them a product, it sells the buyer on an enhanced version of themselves, their own committed identity, which your product just so happens to help them fulfill. And that is the most powerful kind of persuasion there is.